All right, I think we'll begin. This is the last of our series on great Jewish renegades, but the first chronologically. And grateful to our closer, Professor Schoenfeld, who's going to teach tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. Originally, I was supposed to be sharing the stage with my colleague, Dr. Teresa Calpino, who I very much wanted to have here. So for those of you who don't know me, so my name is Devorah Schoenfeld. I teach Judaism in the theology department at Loyola. My work there is I teach two kinds of students. I teach a lot of introductory courses to students who are fulfilling a core requirement, a core theology requirement. And I teach advanced courses for students who are working on degrees, usually in Catholic theology or Catholic ethics. We have graduate programs in Catholic theology, Catholic ethics, and New Testament, and those students will also take my advanced courses. Almost none of my students are Jewish. The majority are Catholic. Most of them are, those who are not Catholic, most are other denominations of Christian. So I work in the field of teaching Judaism to Christians, which is very exciting work, and I think very important work. And actually, as we'll see today, one of the things that I feel like connects me to Paul. All right, Paul of Tarsus. When we were starting thinking about this, Rabbi Wolkenfeld asked if I would like to speak in this series about great Jewish renegades, if I would like to speak about Jesus. And I said, I don't know that I think Jesus was a renegade. That Jesus in his own context, when you read the statements of Jesus, just the things that he said as they're reported in the Gospels, many of them just seem like things that could easily work into Mishnaic conversations. And even some of the edgier things are not completely out there in terms of the rabbinic context. There was a lot of range in the rabbinic context. So I don't know that I could consider Jesus really a renegade. And if it weren't for Paul, I could imagine a universe in which the disciples of Jesus were completely just Jews within the Jewish community. And there might have been a reference or two to Jesus in the Talmud, not of the kinds that we have, but in rabbinic conversation. And there never really would have been a split between Judaism and Christianity. The split between Judaism and Christianity really only came about because of Paul and through the writings of Paul. But did Paul intend to create a new religion, or what did he actually intend to do? That's what I'm going to look at today. So first of all, the dates. Paul lived from the year 5 CE to the year 67. He converted around the year 36 CE. We're going to see what it means by converted. We're going to get some texts on this. But what I want to point out just from that is he never knew Jesus while Jesus was alive. The encounter with Jesus that he had was after Jesus was dead. He was not one of the disciples of Jesus during the lifetime of Jesus. We know Paul mostly through his letters. If you look in the New Testament, those of you who are not familiar with the New Testament, let me give you a brief summary. The first 4 books of the New Testament are the Gospels. These are different retellings of the life of Jesus from 4 different perspectives. Then there's the book of Acts, which tells the stories of the disciples of Jesus. And then there are letters written by disciples of Jesus and by early Christians to communities. And Paul was the most prolific of the letter writers. So what we have from Paul really are the letters that he wrote. I gave you a list here of the letters which are ascribed to Paul. The ones that are considered genuine by most scholars are on the first list, but there are other letters that are also ascribed to Paul. It's important to make this distinction because in the talk today I'm really going to be drawing on the letters that are considered genuine. You'll find other things that are ascribed to Paul in some of these other letters that might contradict what I say, but these are letters that are not normally considered to actually have been written by Paul. Also, to take a look at, if you look at the addressees, so the names of the letters or who the letters were written to, most of these letters, no, all of them, were written to communities and to largely non-Jewish communities. This is important. We're going to get back to this. But before we do, Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine a rabbi who you deeply respect and think is a wonderful teacher. So let's take our own Rabbi Schoenfeld as an example. Let's say this rabbi's teachings draws in lots and lots of people. There's so many people who are just compelled by your vision of tradition and modernity, who love your Daf Yomi class, and lots of people are coming here to study with you. Okay, then the word gets out to the non-Jewish world that there's some good wisdom to be had here. And non-Jews start coming to this synagogue as well to start learning. Okay. Now, the first few would probably want to convert. And fine, we'd have new Jews in the community, that would be great. But soon you would probably get some students who would say, look, I have an issue. I can't live in a Jewish neighborhood. I can't afford to live in a Jewish neighborhood. There's no synagogue in walking distance to me. I can't make it work. Or they would say, I have a job that requires me to work on Shabbat, and I can't get another job. Or they might say, learning Hebrew is just too hard. Or they might say, I really like eating bacon. Or they might say, I'm really close to my non-Jewish family and friends, and I like to do social things with them on Saturdays, and I like to eat with them, and this whole Jewish thing is really not for me. But I'd really like to keep coming here and learning with you anyway. Okay, what would you say?
I don't know. To go for the board.
All right. So let's say you would say yes. So let's say you would say yes. So it gets out there that there's some really good wisdom to be had here in this community, and that you can come and learn this wisdom even if you're not Jewish. Now, as soon as that gets out there in the non-Jewish world, remember, there are a lot more non-Jews than there are Jews. So very quickly, once your teaching becomes popular, very, very quickly, the majority of people in the room are not Jewish. Because there are just so many more of them. Okay, so now they're here. We come to synagogue on Shabbat morning. The majority of your students are not Jewish. And they're here in the community. And they're like, okay, so we're here, and we're not going to convert, but we're the majority of the people here. So how can we be part of the community? Can we still learn with you? Can we daven with you? Can we ever lead any parts of the davening? Can we ever read from the Torah? Maybe if we went off to a side room and read from the Torah during Mincha. Is there any way we can make that work? And because there are more and more of them, it's like, okay, this is starting to become the majority of the community. Let me ask, what would you do in a situation like that? You have a large group of non-Jews who are here to learn with you because they think you have wisdom to share, and yet they're not converting. So what would you do? I can think of a few things you would do, but I'm actually curious to hear what you would say. Yeah?
Share with them the concept of the 7 Noahide laws.
Okay. So you might say, you can't daven from the Amud, but there are other things you can do and you're valuable for doing them. Would you say that they're part of the community or that they're part of a separate community?
I feel like socially, why not?
Okay.
But in terms of halakhic boundaries,
The
that's a question.
Great. Yeah, okay. What else might people do? Large population of non-Jews in this shul who value the learning that goes on here.
Maybe we'd have a breakaway minion for the Jews, and then a big service in English with a longer sermon for the
Sure.
Gentiles. And,
Sure. So you might try to accommodate them. You might say, is there a way that we can make Judaism work for them? But it would be a different sort of Judaism. It would be a Judaism without mitzvot, right? It would be a Judaism that's about the wisdom that these Gentiles are learning, and maybe a few mitzvot, maybe the 7 mitzvot b'nai Noach. But it would be a Judaism without kashrut, without Shabbat, without the regular davening. Okay? What else might you do?
Shana.
Yes, that is definitely another alternative. I said, so okay, let's assume you'd say yes. We could also assume you'd say no. We could say, we're making a rule. If you want to keep coming to shul, you have to become a member, And we are putting in a new bylaw, right, that you can only come to shul a certain amount of time without joining, and only Jews are allowed to join. And if you're not Jewish and you want to be a part of this community, and you want to be a fellow traveler with this community, you have to convert. Okay. Do you think that would be a better option?
No, I was.
There are reasons to think it would be a better option, though. Right? Think of how confusing it is to have in the same community people who have different statuses. Think about how confusing it is to have the majority of the community feel disenfranchised. Right? To have the majority of the people who are praying in a service feel like, well, we can't lead, and we can't do anything, and we're part of a separate community, and we're not really here. And maybe in the first couple years, the people who came here because they were so hungry for the teaching would tolerate it. But after a few years, it would start getting stressful. So maybe the idea to set a clear boundary was, maybe there's something to that idea. All right. So why am I starting with this thought experiment? Because this is the position that Paul was in. Jesus was an extraordinarily impactful teacher. And in the years after the death of Jesus, there were many people who wanted to follow the teachings of Jesus, and not all of those people were Jewish. So in the early community of Jesus followers, we can't really call them Christians yet. They didn't see themselves as a separate religion. If you wanted to become a follower of Jesus, it was like joining any other Jewish community. You would have to convert first. But as the years went on, more and more non-Jews were attracted to the teachings of Jesus. And some of them couldn't convert. Some of them didn't want to convert. And this became a real live problem for the early followers of Jesus who were struggling to figure out what to do.
Why were there more Gentiles attracted to the community of Jesus followers as opposed to any of the other forms of Judaism at that time? Like, was this a problem the synagogue down the street was having that didn't have Jesus followers, or?
So there were non-Jews attracted to other forms of Judaism too.
Okay.
Jesus may have been slightly more open to it than other rabbis at the time, but I don't think it's a total radical difference. Mm-hmm. I think there were non-Jews who were also interested in having conversations with rabbinic Jews, as we see recorded in the Talmud. So this is the context that Paul is working in. And that's where we start to see what typically gets called his conversion story. All right. Question number one that I'm asking, Paul as a renegade. Did Paul depart from Judaism? What did Paul do in his moment of conversion? All right. So there's two versions of the story of how Paul became a Jesus follower. The first version is told in the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, Saul was breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, that is, the early followers of Jesus. Went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogue at Damascus so that he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, who might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So Paul is setting out to draw a clear line between Jews who were not Jesus followers and Jews who were Jesus followers. He is trying to create a community that has clear boundaries. Who's on what side? All right. So he's going along to Damascus. Suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Who's that voice? Jesus. This is Jesus talking to Paul. This is the only encounter that Paul has with Jesus, because remember, Jesus is dead by this point. He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus, who you are persecuting. But go up to the city, do what you are told to do." Okay, so Paul has this moment of seeing Jesus on the way. He then goes back and goes to a synagogue. I'm in verse 20. He began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogue, saying, he is the Son of God. And everyone said, "Wait, weren't you persecuting Christians 5 minutes ago? And now you're saying Jesus is the Son of God?" And then Paul went out to proselytize among the Jews. All right. This is the most popularly told story of Paul's conversions because it's in the book of Acts, which is a narrative, like the Gospels. It tells a story. So here it's telling the story of how Paul became a disciple of Jesus. So before Paul was a disciple of Jesus, he saw himself as a rabbinic Jew who was invested in drawing boundaries between rabbinic Judaism and the early followers of Jesus, and in defining them as outside the community. Then he had this moment, and after this moment, wanted to convince all the rest of the Jews to follow Jesus. Okay, is this a story you've heard before about Paul? Okay, if you've heard a story of Paul's conversion, this is probably the story you've heard. Okay, this story was written in 125 CE. So that's 60 years after Paul died. This story was written by a community in which Jews and Christians had already become separate communities. And the community that's writing this story is thinking back to what they saw as the tragedy of the separation of these two communities. And there's a lot of sadness in looking back to the separation, and they're looking at this as a moment when that separation happened. So this is a story that's being told later, looking back. I mentioned I was going to try to work in the daf. So there, in today's daf from it's Avodah Zarah 19, 17. There's a very sad story about Rabbi Eliezer, who sees himself as being punished because he once got pleasure from hearing a teaching of Jesus. And it's really a very sad story because Rabbi Eliezer is a righteous man, great rabbi, who is punished for not keeping this boundary. And I think it reminds me in a way of this story, that this is retrospectively looking back and telling the story of a sad separation. And telling it in really kind of a harsh way, because it's a separation that by this point both communities were suffering from. Paul himself tells the story of how he became a Jesus follower in a very, very different way. And that's the next text from Galatians. So he begins the book of Galatians. He tells his own story. He says, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin, for I did not receive it as a human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. I was advanced in Judaism, I was zealous, but God, who had set me apart before I was born, called me through his grace, revealed his son to me so I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, and then I went away to Arabia. All right, this is a very different story. This is not a story of radical break. This is a story of someone who was initially invested in drawing boundaries and then stopped wanting to draw those boundaries, but he didn't then go and confront the Jewish community. Instead, he said, I learned from this moment of revelation that Jesus is not outside the realm of what I see Torah to be, and now I'm going to go take that to the Gentiles. So this is his own words, and I think it more accurately describes what he then went out to do. Because as we saw, his letters tend to be directed at non-Jewish communities. So I think this is an important key to understanding what Paul was thinking he was doing. That he was reaching out to non-Jewish communities, but he had not stopped seeing himself as a Jew. He had moved from being a Jew who didn't follow Jesus and who thought that Jesus was outside of the realm of rabbinic Judaism to being a Jew who did follow Jesus. That was the transition, but it wasn't a conversion in the sense of changing his religion, and it certainly wasn't a conversion in the sense of causing him to go and fight against the rabbis that he had once worked with. So if we take the Galatian story as the more consistent with, I don't want to say historically accurate, because neither are completely historically accurate, but more consistent with Paul's own self-perception. So this can feed into a reading of Paul as someone who never stopped being Jewish, who never stopped seeing himself as a Jewish teacher. My reading here is informed by two Jewish scholars of Paul. I gave you a bibliography on the first page. I'll pass around two of the books, but there's two scholars in particular that I'm going to keep referring to. One is Daniel Boyarin, who was my teacher when I did my graduate work at Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. He sees Paul as a critic of Judaism, who was still a faithful Jew, but who nevertheless had an important critique of the Jewish theology of his time. The second is that of Pamela Eisenbaum, who is a professor at Iliff Theological School in Denver. So she is, like me, a Jewish scholar who primarily teaches Christians in a Christian environment. And she sees Paul not as a radical Jew, but as a fairly conventional Jew, really as a fairly normal Jew for his time, who just wanted to find ways to work with Gentiles who wanted to be followers of Jesus and who wanted to learn Torah. So she sees Paul really as very close to the parable that I mentioned a little bit earlier. She sees Paul really just as trying to find a practical solution to the reality of many non-Jews who want to learn Torah and who want to be disciples of Jesus. So these are two scholars who I'm going to follow through this talk. So Boyarin says about the Galatians story, so Paul lived and died convinced that he was a Jew, living out Judaism. He represents one option which Judaism could take in the first century. Paul represents a challenge to Jews in the first century, and I argue that he represents a challenge to Jews now as well. That's Boyarin. Eisenbaum, modern readers of Paul tend to assume that Pharisees and other Jews would have considered Paul an apostate, a Jewish heretic who was no longer part of the Jewish community because of his belief in Jesus and therefore not really Jewish. But belief in a false Messiah doesn't necessarily make you a bad Jew. Plenty of Jews believed in false messiahs then. Some Jews believe in false messiahs now. You can still be within the Jewish community if you believe in a false Messiah. So Paul's belief in Jesus would not have branded him a heretic, a pain in the neck perhaps, but not a heretic. Okay. So these are two perspectives that disagree with each other, and I don't want to lose sight of the disagreement. But I also want to point out the agreement that Paul never stopped being a Jew. Paul never stopped thinking of himself as a Jew and also as a teacher of Judaism. All right, questions to this point? Yeah?
Was Paul actually a rabbi, or?
So Paul says he was a Pharisee and a learned one. Yeah. Yes?
So when you say that he didn't stop thinking of himself as a Jew, then isn't it the case that at that time Judaism it was a nationality, not a religion, so we don't have to think in terms of his choice of having another religion or not a religion?
So there are people who have suggested that Paul, when he says that he's Jewish, what he means is as a nationality. But he also, in his letters, does continue to describe himself as observing halakha and as studying Torah, and in other ways as living a Jewish life. So although you might be correct that the distinction between religion and nationality is a little bit later, I don't think that we can say that Paul was only Jewish in terms of ethnicity and not in terms of
I mean,
religion.
it was a one package.
Yeah. Yes?
So about the changing of his name, wasn't that a separation then from his Jewish past? Saul to Paul?
So another way of looking at it is that it was a more accessible name to use when he was speaking to a Greek audience. So it was like taking a secular name.
Starbucks name.
A Starbucks name, yeah. Yeah. All right. One of the really fraught questions about thinking about Paul and Jewishness is about his relationship to the law. Just to be clear, for the vast, vast majority of Christians, they do not consider themselves to be obligated to follow what we understand as halakha. I say the vast majority because there are exceptions. Seventh-day Adventists is probably the most famous one. And they still do consider themselves to be obligated to follow the moral precepts in the Torah. Think about it this way. Do you think non-Jews are obligated to follow halacha? No. So it's okay for non-Jews to kill and steal?
No.
Right. So we have, as Jews, we have an intuitive understanding that there are some differences between halachot that are really particularly for us and halachot that actually have something to teach the world. We've formalized that a little bit after the time period of Paul. We've formalized that in terms of the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. The Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, I'm not sure existed formally, the theory of it fully laid out at the time of Paul. But I think he was doing something similar. He was saying, I believe that the Torah is from God, and the Torah has things that all people can learn from. And yet, there are also this concept of specific mitzvot that Jews have to follow, and if you're not Jewish, you don't have to follow them. So as a consequence of that, Christians who are, by the time of Paul, and certainly by our time, overwhelmingly not Jewish, don't see themselves as obligated to follow mitzvot. Okay. Another exception, so Messianic Jews, who there's a wide range of, and they're not all terrible. So Messianic Jews have a very bad reputation in Jewish circles because a lot of them do proselytizing and proselytize Jews in bad faith. So, on the other hand, there are some Messianic Jews who see themselves as Christians who want to observe halakha like Jews, because the halakha is from the Torah, and the Torah is from God, and they believe the Torah is from God too, so why shouldn't they? So, it's interesting, this conversation still happens today, right? It seems on some level intuitively obvious that if you believe the Torah is from God, you would want to observe Shabbat. And yet, it's also obvious to us that non-Jews don't have to follow halakha. All right, that's the mess that Paul was walking into. One particular halakha that he tends to circle around is circumcision, because that's a way you convert to Judaism. So when he writes about is it important to be circumcised or does it not matter if you're circumcised, that's what he's talking about. He's saying, do you have to convert to Judaism and to follow halakha in order to be a follower of Jesus? All right.
But the converse, somebody who was Jewish, biologically Jewish, who became a Jesus follower, Paul would say you have to keep observing Shabbat and have to circumcise your child.
It seems that yes. Mm-hmm. And it seems that there were communities that continued to do that until the 7th century.
Wow.
Yeah. They were called Ebionites. And it seems that it only died out because it was just such a small minority in a larger Christian society. And also out of the sense that eventually became very important for Catholics that there's one church, and you don't want to have subdivisions within the church. All right. Having said that, that's where I'm going to get to. But Paul's writings about the law are very complex, very hard to understand, and have been interpreted in a lot of different ways. So here's a doozy from Galatians. Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions, until the offspring would come to whom the promise had been made. It was ordained through angels by a mediator. Now a mediator involves more than one party, but God is one. Is the law then opposed to the promises of God? Certainly not. For if a law had been given that could make alive, then righteousness would indeed come through the law. But Scripture has imprisoned all things under the power of sin, so that what was promised through faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe. Okay, what did you make out of that? Okay, first of all, could you make any sense of it? Okay, neither could the vast majority of the history of biblical interpretation, so you're okay. But if you're going to try to make some sense out of this, okay, up or down on law? Yeah. The law was added because of transgressions, right? It makes it sound like that really, like, ideally, God just wanted us to, love God through Jesus Christ, but the law was given to us because we messed up and God had to do something to us, so God gave us this law. That's kind of what it sounds like. Now, I'm not sure, I don't think it means that, but that is something that you could get out of this text, and that a lot of people have gotten out of this text. So, one classic theory of Paul, which is no longer predominantly how Paul is taught, but you might have heard, is that Paul opposed the law because he saw the law as a consequence of sin. That the law was given to people because they sinned, because they didn't have pure faith, and therefore they had to be given the law. So this is an example of a passage that's been read as very law negative from Paul. Yeah?
So at that time, how could Paul and the other Jesus followers distinguish clearly between the law and morality? I know that for us now it's clear cut, right? It's pretty easy to distinguish between those two, but I wonder if it was something that wasn't that obvious.
So you're correct that it's not that obvious, and it's still not that obvious. I'll give you an example, Sabbath observance. So Sabbath observance, law, and morality. And that's actually been a matter for a lot of interesting debate in the history of Christian theology. When Christians are observing Sunday, are they doing the Sabbath on a different day, or are they doing something else? Right? So one interpretation is, so we're not supposed to keep halakha because we're not Jewish, but it says in the Torah that it's to have a day that's designated to God. So clearly the Torah is from God, and the Torah is full of wisdom, so we should learn that wisdom, and we should have a day that's designated to God. We should do it on a different day, so it's clear that we're not doing it because we're trying to pretend to follow halakha, right? So that's a way of trying to disentangle the law from the morality of the Sabbath.
Right.
It's the difference between learning moral lessons from the Torah and trying to figure out details of practices from it. In some ways, it's closer actually to how we learn Nach. Right? Like when we learn Nach, we don't necessarily do the kind of hermeneutics on every letter to try to figure out what the halacha is to get from Isaiah. But we read it and look for moral lessons. So they would apply the same kind of hermeneutic to the Torah.
And I suppose that's like the clear difference between Christianity and Judaism is that through Christianity there's this theology, they go into analyzing every single bit of it. Like they try to break it down and abstract ideas as opposed to in Judaism where it's more about like just learning about what the law is and following it and such, right? And that's a clear distinction between the two. Right?
So something I'm going to say at the end, but I'll say it now too, is I'm not a fan of dichotomies between Christianity and Judaism in those kind of stark terms. Because usually when you describe something like that, both approaches exist in both traditions, and it's a matter of, it might be even a matter of emphasis, or it might even just be a matter of self-definition. So it might be a matter of, we pride ourselves on reading the Torah in a certain way, so we see it when we do it. But abstract theological thinking is not foreign to Judaism.
Right.
And detailed textual analysis, Christians do that too. So, but what I can say is that the emphasis on the Torah as opposed to Nach is particularly Jewish. I remember when I first heard a Christian make an argument about abortion quoting Jeremiah. And I was like, you can't paskin halakha from Nach. It's like, you know what? Eventually I realized it doesn't say anywhere in the Tanakh that you can't paskin halakha from Nach, right? You would need some other tradition to tell you that. So, okay. All right. Next passage from Romans. This passage was incredibly important to Luther. And also to Augustine. So he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation, for everyone has faith. The righteousness of God is revealed through faith, for faith. It is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. So for Luther, this line became the key to which he read all the rest of the Bible. And it goes back to Augustine had a similar understanding of Paul, that Paul was struggling with his inability to keep the law perfectly, that he was struggling with this feeling that you can never keep halakha 100%. He was always feeling guilty about it, and that eventually he realized, well, really, faith is the only way to truly be one with God. You still have to do your best to be a good person. You still have to do your best to keep halakha, but really faith is what matters. So for Luther, that became the key to the Bible. And Luther drew to a large extent on Augustine from the 5th century Catholic theologian. So this approach exists also for Catholics. So this idea of seeing Luther as someone who said law doesn't matter, faith is all that matters, this is very old and deep in Christian theology and has become very important. But it's definitely come into question by current Christian thinkers. The next list I gave you, A and B, this is from John Gager, who pointed out these are examples of positive and negative things that Paul says about the law. So the A things are the negative things that Paul says about the law, the B things are the positive things that Paul says about the law. So, first example, A, we ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners, yet we know that a person is justified not by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ, because no one will be justified through the works of the law. Okay, based on that statement, what makes you a good person? Faith. Faith. Can law help? No. Okay, statement B. It is not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law who will be justified. Up or down? Up. Yay, law. Okay. Why do you think Paul would say both of these things?
He's saying it to different people.
I think he's saying it about different people. Yeah. Okay, next example. All who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not observe and obey all the things written in the book of the law. B, the law is holy and the commandment is holy and is just and is good. And another example would be, then what advantage has the Jew? Of what value in circumcision? Much in every way. Okay, so here also, in the A statement, relying on the works puts you under a curse. In the second statement, the law is holy, the commandment is holy, circumcision is wonderful, everything about the law is great. Okay, again, how do you get these different statements from the same person? And how do you reconcile them? If you're a Christian reading these statements and trying to figure out how to live a good life as a Christian, go down for law. Yeah.
If he was speaking to different communities and about different communities, it's possible that he still saw the Jews, like we were saying before, that he saw the Jews as obligated in halacha, so they have to keep doing all of these things. For them, those are positive and good things. But for the non-Jews who are joining this community, they aren't obligated. Therefore, for them to go and try and do all of these things would possibly be pointless.
Yes.
And detrimental for them.
Yes. Let's go back to our parable from the beginning of the class. And imagine we have this, in our community, we have a large group of non-Jews, a smaller group of Jews, and as a community, we are committed to reaching all of them. What kind of sermon do you think you would give in the non-Jewish synagogue? So imagine we have these two services. We have the big service in English that's directed at non-Jews, that's accessible, that talks about values. So how might you talk about halakha in that service? You might talk about it not in the most positive way. You might say this is a great thing for those who do it, and yet there are other things that are important too. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I would say, like, if these people are already not following the laws, then he wouldn't want them to feel guilty about it. So he was validating them, so to speak, or attempting to.
He was validating that they can live a good life and be followers of Jesus and get all the benefits of being good Noahide, although he doesn't use that term, non-Jews who are involved in Torah study and they can do it without following the law. And I think that is what he genuinely believed, that it is possible for a non-Jew who isn't circumcised and doesn't keep halakha and doesn't convert to Judaism to be as valuable in God's eyes as someone who is Jewish and who keeps all of the Torah. Yeah.
I would say that his language against the law is very strong.
Yes.
It creates more division rather
Yes.
than bringing people together. And so I think, following what you're saying, if he were to have said things in a different way, it could have brought more respect between the two groups.
Right, so that's another question. Why is he being so harsh in his language? So when you ask who was he speaking to, his negative statements about the law might actually have been directed against Jews. That in saying that when you are keeping the law, don't think that that's enough to make you be doing everything okay. If you're keeping halakha, that doesn't mean you are necessarily acting morally. You still have some other important things to learn. He thought that the teachings of Jesus were very important, and that there were other things that Jews needed to understand, and that following halakha itself wouldn't get you there. So that might be what's going on as well, that he is trying to reach a non-Jewish community, and he had an argument going on with other people in the Jewish community who thought that maybe what he was doing wasn't an okay thing to do. As you know, Jews say their meanest things to each other. So, yes.
So one thing that I'm seeing is that both the positive and the negatives are at least sometimes both coming into Romans, and so, but maybe in different chapters.
Yes.
Is it that each chapter is its own letter to maybe a different group of people, or is it one big letter?
It's one big letter. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I gave for you here 3 different contemporary approaches to dealing with these contradictions in Paul. So the first is John Gager's approach, which says, look, when you have these kinds of contradictions, as one always does when interpreting the Bible, you have to think about where you're going to start from and what you're going to interpret in the light of what. So to give a parallel from our Torah, so think about the 2 stories of how woman was created. Was woman created together with man, or was woman created together out of man's rib? So depending on where you start, you can find 2 different ways to reconcile it. You can say men and women were created together like this, and then separated, and that's the creating out of the rib. Or you can say, you can start with the second version and say woman was created out of man's rib, and the first version is sort of a general chapter heading that's going to give an introduction to what we're going to look at in more detail later. So those are both ways of reconciling the 2 stories, but you have to decide what to start with. Similarly, and that's a classic thing you do when interpreting the Bible, the question of where you start and what you interpret in the light of what is hugely important. So John Gager says one way in which Christian theologians have gone wrong is starting with the law negative passages and interpreting the law positive passages in the light of them. He says, let's start from the other direction. Let's start from looking first at the law positive passages and interpreting the law negative passages in that light. Pamela Eisenbaum develops that into 4 principles for interpreting Paul. So first of all, Paul's audience is made up of Gentiles, so everything he says about the law applies to Gentiles unless specified otherwise. So when Paul says it's bad to keep the law, it means it's bad to convert to Judaism if you're not Jewish. It's bad to run around worrying about keeping halakha if you're not Jewish. You should be worrying about other things. Torah too. Torah is for Jews but provides a standard for all. So there are things to learn from Torah even if you're not keeping halakha. 3, the law is not meant to condemn humanity. It serves a positive pedagogical function. So even if you are not yourself keeping halakha, there are things that you can learn from it. And then finally, the doing of good works is not the opposite of having faith. So that works are important, faith is important, both are important. And in speaking to a non-Jewish audience, it's important to emphasize all of them. Although works are not necessarily going to be the same thing as law or halakha when you're talking to an audience which is not Jewish and not halakhically observant. All right, third approach. Boyarin says Boyarin here reads Paul as an internal critic of Jewish culture. So that's his reading of the harsh language. He says, marginalizing him as the founder of a new religion deflects the force of his cultural challenge. He reads Paul's discourse first and foremost as an inner discourse of the Jewish culture. He sees Paul as strongly criticizing the halakhic centricness of the Jewish community as a critique that Paul was making of Judaism. Now, for Boyarin, the critique that Paul was making of Judaism is specifically the way in which the Jewish community let itself not be concerned with those outside of it. We're going to get to that in a minute. All right, questions about Paul and law? I have 10 minutes. Yes?
You said that, so Paul obviously thought that the teachings of Jesus were very important, and that it could be that he thought that Jews, by just following halacha, were missing something.
Yes.
This could be a more modern approach, but isn't it? Don't we still approach? Do we still approach Judaism as a combination of halacha and learning and understanding that there are moral lessons to be drawn from this?
Absolutely. Right.
So was that not being taught? What was unique about what Jesus was teaching at that point?
So, in many ways, what Jesus was teaching wasn't super unique, but that it was very accessible and very powerful to people, and drew in a large non-Jewish audience. Halakha became important not because it was the only thing that Jews cared about, but because it was the dividing line between Jews and non-Jews. Yeah.
But he didn't only think that Jesus taught important values. He believed that Jesus was the Son of God.
So I was waiting for someone to ask this. Didn't he believe in the Trinity? So Eisenbaum says no, actually. So Eisenbaum says Paul was still monotheistic in the Jewish sense, and the doctrine of the Trinity developed later. Boyarin says maybe, but not in ways that were inconsistent with Judaism at the time. That's also not even clear.
It's not clear from his writings that he felt that...
It's clear that... So to say that Jesus was the Son of God is not the same as saying that Jesus is God, or that Jesus is, or articulating the Trinity as a way of understanding God.
But even if he didn't believe, you take that question out whether he believed he was the Son of God or just the Messiah or whatever, he doesn't say you should follow the teachings of Jesus. He says you should have faith in him.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. That's also important, and that's a piece from Eisenbaum that I thought about bringing in. That she understands faith in Jesus as using Jesus to teach you faith in God. So faith in Jesus it's better translated as faith with Jesus. Yeah.
Like the way Jesus taught it, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
Is that the more modern understanding of Paul, or is she like an outlier in this? Of what Paul thinks?
I didn't do a survey of the different approaches on Paul's relationship to the development of Trinitarianism, so I can't tell you how wide the range is among contemporary scholars. I know it's not completely out there to say that the doctrine of the Trinity developed slowly over generations. Yeah. Okay. Last question. Paul and supersessionism. And honestly...
Sorry, one last, sorry.
Yeah.
Boyarin, what is the critique that Paul's making for Boyarin?
I will get to that.
Okay, fine.
It's on the last page.
Great.
Okay. Okay. Paul and supersessionism. I could have done a whole hour just on this. One of the ways in which the things that people pick over Paul for is the question of what did he understand about the relationship between the Jewish and Christian community? And was he supersessionist? So supersessionism is the idea that God once had a covenant with the Jewish people. God took that covenant away from the Jewish people and gave it to the church. There are Christians who believe this. There are also Christians who don't believe this. It has not been Catholic teaching since Vatican II, but there are plenty of Christians who aren't Catholics, and there are plenty of Catholics who are not up with Vatican II. So it is an approach to Jewish-Christian relations that exists in the world, and Christians who do have this supersessionist theology tend to say that they got it from Paul. But Paul is also an important resource for anti-supersessionist Christian theology. For Christian theological readings that are very clear that the Jewish covenant with God still endures. So I'm going to show you just a couple of pieces in Romans 11. Romans 11, very complicated text that you can read either in supersessionist ways or in anti-supersessionist ways. So if you're going to read it in an anti-supersessionist way, so one thing to pay attention, the beginning that I underlined, I asked then, has God rejected his people? By no means. Okay, fine. Verse 17, if some branches were broken off, and if you, a wild shoot, were grafted in their place to share the rich roots of the olive tree, do not boast over the branches. If you do boast, remember that it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. So Paul here is using a parable of being grafted onto an olive tree. And if you are grafted onto an olive tree, you need to understand that your nourishment comes from the olive tree. So this is a metaphor for how Jews and how the church, even if it may be a separate community, draws its nourishment from the covenant that God made with Israel.
Does he ever specify what species is grafted onto the olive tree?
Another
It's a wild olive shoot. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Then on the next page, on verse 28, I also underlined, as regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake, but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their ancestors, for the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. So by the gospel, it means the teaching of Jesus. So you are in a fight with them about the teachings of Jesus, but election means, so that's a way of talking about the chosen relationship between God and his people. So with regard to election, they are beloved, for the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. God chose the Jewish people. God doesn't take this back. So the relationship, the enduring covenant between God and the Jewish people can never be revoked because God doesn't do that. All right. That line becomes the foundation for the argument against supersessionism in Nostra Aetate, which I have at the bottom of the page there. So Nostra Aetate is from 1965. It's a document from the Second Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council was an ecumenical council. They got Catholic theologians and leaders from all over the world to come together and make some fairly radical changes in how the Catholic Church operated. So before Vatican II, for example, if you were to go to church, they would pray in what language? Latin. Now, if you go to a church, what language do they pray in? Whatever language the people speak. There were a lot of other important changes that happened in Vatican II, but this was definitely an important change, that it asked the church to rethink the relationship with the Jewish people. It says, I'm on the next page, nevertheless, God holds the Jews most clear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes, the calls he issues, such as the witness of the apostle. So based on this verse in Romans, Nostra Aetate says, we have to stop teaching supersessionism. Supersessionism is not Catholic teaching. We have to recognize that the Jewish covenant with God still endures. So that's a pretty radical thing to say. And it's hard for me to think of another example of that, of an authoritative teaching by one religious tradition saying that God has a covenant with another religious community. All right. So the anti-supersessionist reading was just sort of mentioned in Nostra Aetate. It gets fleshed out more in a Vatican document from just a couple of years ago called The Gifts and Calling of God Are Irrevocable. So it takes its title from that line in Paul. And says the covenant of God that God has offered Israel is irrevocable. It says for Christians, the new covenant is Christ is the culminating point of the promises of salvation of the old covenant. So the term covenant, towards the end, therefore means a relationship with God that takes effect in different ways for Jews and Christians. So in this document, it says that there is one covenant that encompasses both Jews and Christians, but in different ways. So in theory, a believing Catholic who sees this as part of their authoritative teaching sees Jews as being part of the same covenant with God that they are in, and that the church has now been included in this enduring covenant between God and the Jewish people that goes back to the time of Abraham. So this has its roots in Paul. Yeah?
Does that change anything as far as accepting Jesus as a Savior and the impact that it would have for you after death?
In other words, they believe that Jews can go
Jews
to
need to
convert in order to be saved? No, of course Jews don't have to convert in order to be saved.
Because they're already part of the covenant.
Yeah. Now, so a question comes up is, can a Jew convert to Catholicism if they want to? And that actually gets complicated here. So.
And if he does that get him out of mitzvah?
Yeah. All right. I need to end. I'm seeing time is running out, and that's good because I'm on my last text and my last question, which is the question of, is there any way in which Paul can be our teacher? So Boyarin explains Paul's critique of Judaism in this way. He says, the genius of Christianity is the concern for all the peoples of the world. The genius of rabbinic Judaism is the ability to leave all other people alone. And each of these modes has a genius and it also has a failure mode. That Christians come from a place of concern with everyone in the world. Well, that also means they can get in the practice of forcibly converting other people because they're concerned with other people. And if you care about people, you want them in the right religion. Jews have the ability to respect other people's religious traditions, but also sometimes to just disengage with them. So to go back to our parable at the beginning of the class, the community, our community suddenly full of non-Jews, this is not a theoretical question. And this is the question that Boyarin is asking. We are in a world in which there are many people that actually care a lot about Judaism. And what are we going to do in response to that? That was Paul's challenge, how to relate to the many, many non-Jews out there who didn't want to convert to Judaism, but wanted to learn Torah and wanted to learn the Torah of Jesus. So I teach Judaism at a Catholic university. I spend my life teaching people who are interested in Judaism and who are interested in it not just as a world religion, but who are interested in it as Torah, but are never going to convert. And there are a lot of people like that out there. You know, when I said in the beginning, this theoretical question of people who come to our synagogue and find it very powerful but are never going to convert, that's not theoretical. That's what happens to my students every semester, right? They often have a very powerful experience by being here. So the challenge that Paul leaves us with is, what can we say from our Torah to the rest of the world? Is there room for finding this genius within our tradition as well? My friend Malka Simkovich, who's spoken here, has done a lot of work on universalism versus particularism in the Second Temple period, and has shown that before the division between Judaism and Christianity, this thread of being concerned with all the people in the world also existed in Judaism. So when Judaism and Christianity divided, we got half of it. We got concern with our people, and it takes work to hold on to our concern with the rest of humanity. So I leave that with the challenge of, can Paul have anything still to teach us today? All right, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. All right.
All right.